Hey everyone, I got a question in the comments of my last Q&A video, and that question was, how can I create 4-bar or 64-step patterns? They say they know there's a step length function, but it's really difficult to understand how to implement it and then how to enter steps on what would be bars 2, 3, and 4. They also mentioned that they come specifically from an Elektron background, so I've brought out my Digitone, which I'm still learning the workflow on, but I think it'll be helpful to actually be able to directly compare these. And I'm going to do that kind of on almost 3 different levels. The most basic, straightforward way, slightly less straightforward, and then abstract. Let's start with the straightforward way. So the straightforward answer is there is no way of getting more than 16 steps on the OP-Z. There's no second page. There's no way of getting a 64-step pattern or anything like that unless you were to pattern chain, but that doesn't count because you can pattern chain on this too. One thing that's very confusing is that they use the same terms to mean different things. When the Digitone says length, it's referring to how long will the pattern go before it repeats, how long does the sequencer run, and it ranges between 2 and 64. That is called the count on the OP-Z, and it only ranges between 1 and 16. Length on the OP-Z is referring to how long each of these steps takes. Like how much space it takes. So that's the equivalent of scale on this, but looked at from a different perspective. So scale of 1 is equal to a step length of 1. And if I change my scale to 1/2, that means that instead of each of these steps being a 16th note, each of these is an 8th note. That's the equivalent of step length 2. 4 is the same as 1/4. So each of these is a quarter note. I'm going to pause here to answer your other question, which is, how would you know how to enter steps onto what would be bars 2, 3, and 4? I think that's easiest to do if you have the step length of 4, because now each step is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's one measure, 2, 2, 3, 4, second measure, 3, 2, 3, 4, third, 4, 2, 3, 4, fourth measure. So it's pretty easy now to tell what happens where. And this is, I guess the simplest application would probably be on the drum track, because it's going to be very common. So I just changed the step length for the step count for this example. It would be very common to just have a snare on 2 and 4. So I can do that, and it's
1, 2, 3, 4.
Right? So that makes, I hope that makes some sense. That's how you would find it, but it is just trickier, and it's not going to be as intuitive. If you're used to this being beats 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's probably a little bit difficult to think of it as measures 1, 2, 3, and 4, and these as beats 1, 2, 3, and 4. It also gives you less room to work with the timing. So all the restrictions you would have if you only had one page on a Digitone, most of them apply to the OP-Z as well. So for instance, if you wanted to play like a long melody and just have it take up 64 steps like this person was asking about, there's really not a way of doing that on the OP-Z. So now I've covered the beginner and the kind of like more complicated answer. And that answer is that the OP-Z has scale, and that's probably the equivalent. 1/8 scale means each of these is a half note, and that's the equivalent of a step length of 8. 9 would be the same as a 1/16 scale, which at least the Digitone isn't able to do. I'm going to bring this back to 1 for the rest of this example. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. Now let's get kind of weird. This isn't as limiting as it might seem, because these two devices handle steps very, very, very differently. So what I mean by that is that if I enter a step here, I can pretty quickly say, okay, make this really, it doesn't accelerate that? Well, you're seeing how not great I am at this. So I can make this a half, held for a half note, right? And that's going to hold this note for that whole time. I don't have the audio coming out of this right now, which is why you can't hear it. But the problem is that if I want another step, if I want to use any of those other steps, that means I have to have it play while this note's playing. That's not actually even the case on the OP-Z. If I want to take this note and I want to hold it for this long, oops, let me change that to 1 so that they're the same. I could do it that way, or I could do a pulse hold 8. And what I'll do just to illustrate that is I'll do a D right after it as well. Oops. So my point is that you can't do this sort of thing on an Elektron sequencer, I don't believe. I don't believe it's possible to just have the sequencer pause here, because this is just always going to be read in a linear way. the OP-Z is just very different. One of my favorite little tricks here, let me just set it up real quick, is that you can have the sequencer go backward. So yes, it takes a while to get used to the step components, but my point is that with the step components, you're also able to change the sequencer, and each of these steps can contain a lot more information on the OP-Z than it can here. Yes, you can do a lot, and I know there's conditions, you could have probability, you can have things that depend on previous triggers or neighboring or the neighbor track triggers. You know, you can have it alternate based on whether it's a fill or not. There's a lot you can do here. But the OP-Z covers like almost everything else. The OP-Z covers it if you say, you know, I just want this part to repeat 3 times and then play this one. And you don't want to copy that to different pages or figure out some other way of, you know, copying these notes here, then to this, then to the, the second page, copy it here, and then have that variation. On the OP-Z, I'm skilled enough with step components, and the whole reason I create all these series is to help others be this skilled with it, to accomplish just that very quickly. Or that I can accomplish that very quickly right here. And I don't have to copy things over. I don't have to get really like abstract with it. And I can have the conditions just right here. So I can say, play this on 2 and 3 of every 3, instead of having to make that change on a separate page. I don't know if that's making sense, but my point is that I can fit a lot of information on just one step here. And let me actually take that to a bit of an extreme here. So I'm just going to add a G right there, change our step length, so that way this happens a bit more often. And I'm going to add a parameter lock to add the effect sends. I'm going to make that parameter lock happen, let's say, every 4th time. I'm going to add a random component spark, and I'm going to give it a tonality 3. So I'm saying randomly make this an octave higher. And then on top of that, I can actually add a trigger spark. So this is saying only play the note every 2nd time, randomly make it an octave higher, and on the 4th time, I want you to also have those sends, the additional sends there. Oops. What's this jump? Oh, I gave it a jump 3. I meant to do a tonality 3. There we go. And believe it or not, this is actually a fairly simple example. And I understand why people would maybe hate the OP-Z for how complicated things can get, but to me, this is how my brain can think of music. Not with, you know, those triggers and stuff, but like, for instance, I was surprised that I couldn't separately apply locks and conditions to the parameter locks on the Digitone when I could apply conditions to that trigger. And I was also surprised when it's just like, oh yeah, the sequencer just goes in a linear way, which of course, like that's, you know, how they've worked for forever. But just having spent so much time on the OP-Z, it struck me that I was like, oh, I feel like almost limited. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, because like I said, if you want to play, if you want to play a 64-step pattern, the OP-Z is going to make your life pretty miserable. And you'd probably be better off using a different device, not necessarily a Digitone, but almost any other sequencer. But to be able to just think, okay, I want this first part to play 3 times, and I want there to be on the 3rd time a bunch of parameter locks that finally apply, then transition into this part B for 1 playthrough. And then the 2nd time it plays as part B, I want those notes to be an octave higher. Like, I can do all that. And that's sort of how I think of music, less like copying and pasting triggers and copying and pasting pages and all that stuff, which probably is very effective once you're fast at it. But this is just more like how I think of music. And my brain is weird, and it might not work the same as yours. But I hope this gives you some sense of the ways that they differ, and why I don't think that's maybe as big of a loss as it might seem at first. Let me know if you have more questions. I hope this video was helpful, and hopefully 10 minutes isn't too long. Thank you for watching.